It was a March night in Asheville, North Carolina, in the year 1948, when a quiet institution meant for healing became the stage of an ending. A fire rose from the kitchen of the Highland Hospital, and before the night was done, the flames claimed 9 lives, among them Zelda Fitzgerald. The woman once called the first flapper, once celebrated as the very spirit of the jazz age, perished in her sleep behind the locked doors of a psychiatric ward, her story closing not with applause but with smoke and silence. Dear listener, welcome to this shared space of memory. Before we begin this journey into the past, I invite you to leave your own mark upon the present. Let me know in the stillness of the comments where and when you listen. In this way, across continents and hours, a tapestry of memory will weave itself, binding us as fellow travelers through history. And if you wish this channel of remembrance to endure, please consider pressing the button of support so that the echoes of lost voices may continue to reach those who seek them. The fire still smolders in the imagination. Though the years have passed, its glow now fading into the smoke of remembrance. To begin a tale at its ending is to honor the strange symmetry of life, for the final blaze at Highland was not unlike the flame that Zelda Fitzgerald herself carried through her days, restless, dangerous, luminous, and consuming. From that light we travel backward, as if drawn upstream toward the beginning of her restless journey. The flames retreat into the shadows, and the shadows dissolve into the soft radiance of Montgomery, Alabama, where Zelda Sayre was born in the hot summer of 1900, into a world both genteel and suffocating. Her father, Anthony Dickinson Sayre, was a judge known for his sternness and dignity, a man who valued tradition and silence. Her mother, Minnie Machen, more lively, carried within her the echo of eccentricities and a different kind of dream. Zelda was the youngest of 6, arriving into a house that was both orderly and shadowed by the strict codes of Southern life. But from the first, she was restless, refusing to move in step with the patterns laid before her. She climbed trees when other girls practiced curtsies, swam boldly in the Alabama River when others embroidered linens, and laughed with a recklessness that unsettled the elders of her town. Montgomery, at the turn of the century, was a place of magnolia blossoms and lingering echoes of the Confederacy, a place where history pressed down upon the living. The streets were slow with heat, and the rhythm of society demanded composure, modesty, restraint. Yet within this frame, Zelda danced, laughed, and defied. There was in her a spark that no convention could contain. It was not only rebellion for rebellion's sake, but a hunger, a yearning for something beyond. As though the walls of Montgomery were too narrow to hold her, as though the air itself lacked the necessary oxygen to feed the fire of her being. Some would later call her wild, others would call her tragic, but here, in her youth, she was simply alive with an intensity that frightened as much as it charmed. She would arrive at dances barefoot, her hair loose, daring others to follow her lead. She swam at night under the watch of the moon. She painted her face in playful mimicry of the theater. The young men of Montgomery admired her beauty, her golden hair, her laughter that seemed to promise untold adventures. The young women whispered, half envious, half scornful, of a girl who seemed to care so little for the codes that bound them all. One can imagine the sultry evenings of Alabama, where cicadas sang and lanterns glowed on porches, and Zelda, restless, pacing her room, dreaming of more. How does a spirit such as hers breathe in a world that expects silence and obedience? What dreams are born when the present feels too small? Perhaps even she did not yet know, but something within her body and mind sought release, a stage, a canvas, an audience. Yet Montgomery was not a city that offered stages wide enough for such performances. It was here, though, that fate arranged its first act. In 1918, a young lieutenant in the United States Army was stationed at nearby Camp Sheridan. His name was Francis Scott Fitzgerald, not yet the author known to the world, but already filled with ambition, already burning to capture in words the glitter and sorrow of his age. He met Zelda Sayre at a country club dance. She was 17, radiant and untamed. He was 21, already sketching her image in his mind. That night was the beginning of a dance that would span decades, a dance of love and rivalry, admiration and destruction. For Scott saw in Zelda the living embodiment of the modern spirit he longed to capture on the page. And Zelda, in turn, saw in him a door into a world beyond Montgomery, beyond the South, beyond the narrow path that would otherwise have been hers. She resisted him at first with a teasing cruelty, refusing his proposals, making him prove himself. Yet even in resistance, a thread was drawn between them. Letters flew like sparks, and soon the restless girl of Montgomery found herself bound to the restless boy of St. Paul. But before we arrive at their union, let us pause again in her girlhood. There is a temptation to read her childhood only as prologue to the marriage that would define her in history's eyes. Yet in those early years, we see the first outlines of a spirit that would never be content with a single role, a single name. She was dancer, painter, writer, performer, long before she was wife, muse, or patient. The riverbanks of Alabama heard her laughter. The oak trees knew her daring. The summer nights witnessed her longing. What might have become of her had Scott never entered Montgomery? Had she taken another path? Would she have burned less brightly, or perhaps endured longer? Such questions float without answer, yet they hover as we recount her tale. Imagine her standing at the Montgomery train station, the whistle blowing in the humid air. Soldiers in uniform depart for war. Families gather with handkerchiefs and tears. The South hums with expectation and dread. Zelda is there, her dress catching the light, her eyes restless. Beyond the horizon lies a life she cannot yet imagine, a love both brilliant and ruinous, a stage upon which she will dazzle and stumble. The whistle carries the sound forward into the years to come, and we too must follow it as the next part of her story unfolds. The whistle drifts through the warm night air, carrying its long, sorrowful cry beyond Montgomery, out over the dark fields, and into the restless heart of Zelda Sayre. In that sound, as though borne on the rails themselves, there is the promise of departure, of a life not yet lived, of a story gathering its first fragile outlines. It is here, in this place where soldiers and families converge, that her path crosses with one who would become both her mirror and her undoing. Francis Scott Fitzgerald arrives not with fortune nor with fame, but with an eager ambition that glimmers as dangerously as her own wildness. He's a young lieutenant stationed nearby at Camp Sheridan, a man in uniform carrying with him not only the scent of war but the fragile armor of untested dreams. When their eyes first meet at a dance in the country club, one imagines the atmosphere heavy with summer heat, lantern light falling across polished floors, the distant strains of a band stumbling between ragtime and waltz. Zelda, 17, bright with the careless beauty of youth, moves among admirers like a flame among moths. Scott watches, already composing, already seeking a way to capture in words what her presence stirs in him. She seems to him less a girl than a symbol, the embodiment of modernity itself, free and mocking, daring and alive. She, for her part, studies him with both amusement and skepticism. A young officer is no novelty in Montgomery. Uniforms fill the town as the Great War still rages overseas. But there is something in his gaze that is more than admiration. It is hunger, the hunger of one who must turn life into art, who must possess in order to create. Their courtship is not gentle, not steady, but sharp and volatile from the beginning. Scott falls almost instantly, but Zelda resists. She tests him with indifference, dismissing his proposals, refusing to promise herself to a man without wealth or certainty. To many, this might seem cruelty, but in truth, it was the instinct of a girl who knew that her own life could not be given lightly. She had seen too many women in Montgomery surrender to comfort and fade into anonymity. She demanded that Scott prove himself, not merely as a suitor, but as a man who could match the fire that lived within her. Letters passed between them, his filled with longing and determination, hers laced with wit and teasing dismissal. He wrote and rewrote, edited his passion as though it were a draft of a story he could not yet complete. In these letters, one glimpses the pattern that would define their union. Scott attempting to mold the chaos of experience into crafted words, and Zelda insisting upon the primacy of living itself. She was not content to be a muse sitting quietly in the corner of his imagination. She was herself a living, moving, speaking force. Yet he saw her as both, inspiration and challenge, goddess and rival, the figure who could both elevate his art and endanger it. Outside their private exchanges, the world moved toward change. The war drew to its uncertain close in 1918, and with it the promises of youth began to shift. Scott was discharged before ever seeing battle, carrying with him a sense of unfulfilled destiny. For Zelda, the armistice brought a continuation of dances and gaiety, a society eager to drown itself in distraction after the shadows of conflict. They met in this atmosphere, two restless spirits seeking release, though what they found in one another was less release than entanglement. The elders of Montgomery frowned upon their pairing. Scott was a northern outsider, Catholic in a Protestant world, lacking the fortune that would have secured his place. Zelda, though admired and desired by many, was warned against him. But warnings only served to inflame her interest. She relished the disapproval, for it affirmed her difference, her unwillingness to conform. In Scott's ambition, she recognized a reflection of her own refusal to settle. Yet even then, perhaps, she understood that his ambition was not merely for life, but for life as it might appear on the printed page. He wished to conquer through words, while she wished simply to live. One can imagine the two of them walking through the humid Montgomery nights, the air heavy with the scent of honeysuckle, the sound of cicadas droning like a hidden chorus. He speaks of novels not yet published, of fame not yet achieved, of New York shimmering on the horizon. She listens, sometimes laughing, sometimes mocking, always aware that this dreamer might, if he succeeds, carry her far from the boundaries of her town. Yet she also senses the danger, to be captured within his vision, to become not herself, but his creation. Was she willing to risk becoming a character in someone else's book? Did she believe that her spirit was strong enough to resist, to remain her own? For nearly 2 years, the dance continued. Scott returned to New York to seek his fortune, struggling in advertising, rewriting the manuscript that would become his first great success. Zelda lingered in Montgomery, attending dances, receiving other suitors, but never releasing the thread that bound her to him. It was a test, perhaps, awaiting to see whether he could make real the promises he whispered. She would not leave the South for mere dreams. She would leave only if the world itself opened to them. And so it was in 1920, when his novel This Side of Paradise was published, that the threshold was crossed. Overnight, Scott became the voice of a generation, his book embraced by young men and women eager to see themselves mirrored in its restless characters. Wealth did not immediately follow, but fame did, and with fame came the proof Zelda had demanded. She accepted his proposal, and in April of that year, they were married in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. But before we rush to that union, let us remain a moment longer in Montgomery, for it is here that Zelda's first transformation occurs. The girl who ran barefoot into dances, who swam in the river at night, who mocked the constraints of Southern gentility, she now chooses to leave it all behind. One wonders at the mixture of triumph and sorrow in that departure. Did she feel she had conquered her town by refusing to bend to its rules? Or did she feel, in some quiet place within, that she was abandoning a part of herself? The whistle that once promised freedom now promises something else, not only escape, but surrender to a shared fate. The whistle sounds again, carrying her away from Montgomery, away from the Magnolia Nights, toward the bright and dangerous city where she and Scott would begin their life together. The unopened letter he once sent lies, still in memory, folded in the air between them, the paper waiting to be read, the words waiting to be believed. And so we follow her, from the humid streets of Alabama to the marble steps of New York, as the next chapter of her story begins. The letter lies unopened, waiting upon the table of memory, its paper crisp with words unspoken, its envelope sealed like a promise yet to be fulfilled. From that stillness, the air shifts, and we find ourselves in the cathedral hush of New York City in the spring of 1920. Zelda Sayre, now Zelda Fitzgerald, steps forward with the light of triumph and anticipation in her eyes. The girl from Montgomery, who once defied the whispered warnings of her town, has now bound her fate to the young author whose book has startled the world awake. Scott, flushed with the sudden success of this side of paradise, stands at her side, the city rising around them in towers of stone and glass. They have crossed a threshold together, the whistle's cry now transformed into the clangor of streetcars, the clatter of heels upon sidewalks, the endless hum of ambition that pulses through Manhattan. Their marriage was not merely a union of two individuals, but the birth of a spectacle. Almost at once, they became symbols of the new decade. The 1920s were opening their doors, releasing the youth of America into a carnival of liberation, and Scott and Zelda were at its center. They drank from champagne bottles in taxis, bathed fully clothed in fountains, danced until dawn in hotel ballrooms. Newspapers chronicled their escapades, fascinated by this golden couple who seemed to embody the spirit of a generation unafraid to laugh at propriety. Zelda, with her blonde hair cropped short, her skirts daringly lifted, and her eyes sparkling with mischief, became known as the first flapper, the living icon of the jazz age. But beneath the shimmer, something more fragile stirred. Scott saw in Zelda both muse and trophy, the evidence of his triumph, the flesh and blood embodiment of the characters he sought to capture in his novels. Yet Zelda, restless as ever, resisted being reduced to a character in his stories. She was not content to serve merely as inspiration. She sought her own expression, her own recognition. Even as she relished the whirlwind of attention, she pushed against the cage it implied. When he wrote, she accused him of stealing her lines, her thoughts, her very essence. And perhaps he did. For what was his art if not the shaping of life into narrative, and what life was closer at hand than hers? In those early New York years, their love was as intoxicating as the liquor they drank with abandon, but it carried within it the seeds of destruction. They quarreled fiercely, reconciled passionately, and repeated the cycle again and again. Their marriage was less a harmony than a duet of competing voices, each refusing to yield. He demanded devotion. She demanded freedom. He sought permanence on the page. She sought immediacy in the dance of life. Together they created an image dazzling to the world, yet corrosive in its intimacy. New York itself became a stage upon which their drama played. The city was alive with energy, its nights lit by electric signs and jazz spilling from speakeasies. The Fitzgeralds moved through this landscape as though it had been built for them, leaving behind a trail of extravagance. There were stories of them riding atop taxis through Fifth Avenue, of Scott diving into fountains while Zelda cheered, of the two of them turning hotel lobbies into impromptu stages for their wild performances. To the public, they were glamorous, untouchable, a living fairy tale. But fairy tales, as history teaches, often carry within them darker truths. For even as Scott's fame grew, so too did the shadow of his dependence on her. He mined their life together for material, turning private quarrels into dialogue, private gestures into narrative. Zelda recognized herself in his heroines, charming, reckless, vulnerable, and she both delighted and despaired at the theft. To be immortalized in literature is no small gift, yet to be consumed by it is another matter. Could she truly remain herself when the world began to see her only through his words? Was she living her life or performing the life he required her to live so that he might capture it in ink? Their evenings ended often in quarrels, the laughter of champagne giving way to bitter accusations. Yet in the morning they would rise again, arm in arm, ready to perform their part before the city. Theirs was not a quiet domestic life, but a constant stage, a spectacle of desire and destruction. Zelda herself seemed to thrive in the attention, yet each gesture carried within it the hint of exhaustion, as though she was already aware of the cost. One can imagine them in their small apartment, the noise of the city drifting through open windows, Scott at his desk wrestling with sentences, Zelda pacing restlessly, longing for movement, for expression beyond the confinement of his pages. The apartment fills with smoke and typewriter clatter, the faint smell of alcohol lingering in the air. Outside, the city roars, but within, two young lives press against each other, seeking both fusion and escape. And still, there was love, fierce, unyielding, undeniable. Whatever storms raged between them, they returned again and again to one another, drawn by a magnetism neither could explain nor resist. Their passion burned, not in spite of their quarrels, but through them. Each insult carried the weight of intimacy, each reconciliation, the fire of necessity. They could not exist apart, yet together they consumed one another. It was in this furnace of love and rivalry that Scott began to shape his great works, and Zelda her great struggle. New York witnessed the opening act of their marriage. The laughter and the tears entwined so tightly that they became indistinguishable. She was hailed as the epitome of youth and freedom, yet already she was pressing against the invisible walls of his shadow. The world applauded, but within, the battle had begun. One night, perhaps, after one of their endless evenings of drinking and dancing, the two returned home, still glittering from the lights of the city, only for a moment of carelessness to break the spell. A glass of champagne slips from her hand, crashes to the floor, and shatters. The fragments scatter across the wooden boards, catching the lamplight, tiny stars fallen from their orbit. They both fall silent, staring at the broken glass as though it were a mirror of their own brilliance, dazzling, dangerous, impossible to hold. And it is upon those shards that we leave them, the fragments gleaming in the lamplight, promising that what dazzles most brightly may also wound most deeply. The shards of glass lie scattered on the floor, sharp fragments that catch the lamplight like tiny stars fallen from their constellations. The silence after their shattering lingers in the room, heavy with meaning, as though some omen has been spoken, not in words, but in the fragile language of broken crystal. From these fragments, a new image rises, one that the world would seize upon and name, Zelda Fitzgerald, the first flapper, the woman who would come to embody an entire age of defiance and delight. The broken glass, dazzling yet dangerous, becomes the perfect symbol for the persona she carried into the world. The 1920s unfolded with a rush of sound and color, a decade alive with jazz, fast cars, and new freedoms. The war was over. The young refused to bow to the sorrow of the past, and the air itself seemed charged with rebellion. Women cut their hair short, lifted their skirts, smoked cigarettes in public, and declared themselves free of the restraints that had bound their mothers. Zelda was not merely swept along in this current. She was at its forefront, shaping it, embodying it. With her cropped blonde hair and bold laughter, her reckless dancing and disregard for propriety, she became the flapper incarnate, the figure journalists pointed to when they sought to describe the new woman of the age. But what was it to live as a symbol? For Zelda, it was at once exhilarating and confining. She delighted in shocking the old order, in laughing at rules and transforming ordinary moments into spectacles. She dove into fountains, rode atop taxis, painted her cheeks bright in mimicry of the theater, and spoke with an irreverence that startled the press. Wherever she and Scott went, eyes followed, for they seemed less like a married couple than like performers upon an endless stage. Their antics were chronicled in magazines, turning their private adventures into public legend. The world was eager for such figures, eager to crown them as king and queen of the jazz age. Yet the crown, as always, was heavy. In Scott's novels, Zelda began to appear, not by name but in spirit. His heroines, reckless, beautiful, free, were often shadows of her. The public devoured these characters, not realizing how deeply they were drawn from life, nor how much they cost the living woman who inspired them. To be made eternal in literature is a strange fate. It grants immortality, yet it steals the right to define oneself. Zelda laughed at times, proud of the influence she held. At other times, she grew resentful, insisting that he had taken her words, her gestures, even her diary, and turned them into his own. Still, in these years, she was radiant, her presence undeniable. One can imagine her entering a party, the room shifting as if the air itself had acknowledged her arrival. The band plays faster, the dancers quicken their steps, laughter grows louder, for Zelda Fitzgerald has come. She dances with abandon, her movements daring, her eyes flashing with mischief. Those who watch cannot help but believe she has discovered a secret the rest of them have only guessed at. To be near her was to feel that life itself had grown more vivid. Yet when the music ended and the lights dimmed, the question always returned. What remained when the performance was over? The persona of the flapper was both gift and burden. Zelda thrived in its freedom, yet she was also trapped by its expectations. The world wanted her to be endlessly charming, endlessly daring, endlessly reckless. But beneath the glitter, she was searching for a deeper form of expression. She painted, she wrote, she longed for a stage of her own. And when she voiced these ambitions, Scott resisted, fearing that her creativity might compete with his own. What is a muse who refuses to remain silent? What happens when the symbol begins to demand authorship? These questions lay unspoken between them, the source of quarrels that would intensify as the years went on. Even within their circle of friends, whispers arose. The Fitzgeralds drank too much, fought too openly, exposed too much of their private life to the public gaze. Yet it was precisely this volatility that fascinated others. Ernest Hemingway, who would later enter their lives, saw in Zelda a rival to Scott's attention, and he accused her of madness, of jealousy, of sabotage. Others saw in her not madness, but brilliance misunderstood, a woman who refused to be reduced to the role of silent wife. Between admiration and suspicion, she moved like a dancer across a stage lit by shifting lights, her every step both celebrated and scrutinized. One night, perhaps, as they left yet another party, the echo of laughter still following them into the night, Zelda must have felt the strange emptiness of applause. For applause fades quickly, leaving silence behind. And in that silence, what did she hear? Did she hear the echo of her own thoughts, demanding to be written, demanding to be danced, demanding to be painted? Or did she hear only the laughter of strangers, still echoing, reminding her that she was more image than person in the eyes of the world? The laughter lingers as a haunting refrain, rising and falling in the dark streets of New York, echoing in the alleys and stairwells, dissolving at last into silence. And it is in that silence that her story takes its next turn, carrying her far from the city's towers and into the cafes and galleries of Paris, where her search for self would grow sharper, her rivalries deeper, and her dissent more pronounced. But for now, we leave her poised between laughter and silence, her figure outlined by the glow of a city that both adored and consumed her. The laughter of strangers fades, dissolving into an unfamiliar cadence, a shift in the air where the language itself changes. The echoes of New York nights stretch across the ocean, and when they settle again, they take form in the lilting sounds of French conversation, in the clinking of glasses at Parisian cafes, in the shuffle of artists moving restlessly through Montparnasse. Here, in the City of Light, Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald stepped into a world that seemed to promise even more than the New York they had conquered. Paris in the 1920s was the gathering place of dreamers, exiles, and creators, a place where tradition had been shattered by war, and where new art sought to rebuild the world in startling forms. For Zelda, it was both a liberation and a mirror, for here she found not only freedom, but also her reflection in others who struggled with the same hunger for expression. The Fitzgeralds arrived amid the swirl of the so-called lost generation. Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, Ezra Pound, Picasso. These were the names spoken in the cafes, the figures who drank and argued and sought to redefine life itself through art. To some, Zelda and Scott seemed like bright comets streaking across this firmament, dazzling in their brilliance, admired and envied in equal measure. They moved through salons and soirees with their usual mixture of charm and volatility, their presence impossible to ignore. Scott, already intoxicated by his early fame, sought to assert himself among these towering figures of literature. Zelda, equally magnetic, refused to fade into the background. But in this city of artists, the question of creation grew sharper. Scott drew constantly from their life together, shaping novels and stories that depended on Zelda's presence, her wit, her gestures, her very sentences. Zelda, however, began to feel the hunger to create on her own terms. She painted, she danced, she wrote. Her notebooks filled with fragments, her canvases with images both playful and haunting. Yet when she showed these works to Scott, he often dismissed them, fearing they would distract from his own writing or, worse, compete with it. In this atmosphere, their love became more than passion. It became rivalry, a struggle for artistic recognition in which neither was willing to yield. The cafes of Paris witnessed their quarrels as much as their laughter. At one table, they would dazzle friends with their charm. At another, they would fall into bitter arguments, their voices rising above the music and chatter. Scott accused Zelda of undermining his work, of distracting him, of threatening his focus. Zelda accused him of theft, of draining her life into his novels while denying her the right to speak in her own voice. Friends who watched them disagreed in their interpretations. Some believed Zelda was unstable, that her jealousy poisoned Scott's genius. Others believed Scott was cruel, that he feared her talent and sought to suppress it. The truth, as ever, lay in the shifting ground between these views. And yet, for all the bitterness, Paris was also a place of beauty for Zelda. She walked the boulevards with her head lifted to the sky, drinking in the colors of the markets, the scent of fresh bread, the sound of accordion music drifting from the streets. She visited galleries where canvases shattered the rules of form and perspective, and in them she saw a reflection of her own restless imagination. She began to paint with greater urgency, her works filled with whimsical figures and bright, unsettling colors. There was in them both innocence and darkness, a strange blending that seemed to echo her own soul. But even here, her efforts were overshadowed by the demands of her husband's career. He needed her not as an artist, but as a muse, not as a voice, but as an echo. One can imagine her sitting at a small table in a cafe, the smoke of cigarettes curling upward, the murmur of French voices surrounding her. Before her lies a sketchbook, pages filled with lines half-formed, ideas only partly realized. She pauses, her gaze drifting to Scott across the table, his pen moving quickly across a notebook as he crafts dialogue for his latest story. He glances at her as though to ensure she remains within his orbit, as though afraid that if she wanders too far into her own world, she will no longer be his to shape. She closes the sketchbook quietly, as if tucking away a part of herself, and smiles with forced amusement at his words. The cafe fills with laughter once again, but the sketchbook remains closed, the drawing silent. The tension between them grew with each passing season. Scott's drinking deepened, his need for validation more urgent, his demands on Zelda more relentless. She responded with defiance, with bold displays of independence, with flirtations and provocations that stoked his jealousy. Their love was still fierce, but it had become a weapon as much as a bond, each strike leaving scars that would not heal. And yet, even in their darkest moments, they returned to one another, bound by a force neither fully understood. For Zelda, Paris was not only a stage for their rivalry, but also the beginning of her own artistic awakening. She began to take ballet lessons with unusual devotion, her body moving through the positions with determination that bordered on obsession. The discipline, the precision, the demand for perfection, all these drew her in, offering a form of expression that did not depend on Scott's approval. But with this devotion came strain, for ballet demanded more than her body could easily give. She practiced until her muscles screamed, until exhaustion overtook her, as though she sought to prove through pain that she possessed her own identity, her own art. In the studios where she danced, the echoes of footsteps on wooden floors seemed to answer the laughter of the Parisian nights. The laughter fades now into silence, into the sharp, rhythmic sound of point shoes striking against wood. The sound is insistent, demanding, almost relentless. It is here, in this sound, that we glimpse the next stage of Zelda's life. The dancer, the dreamer, the woman who would chase perfection even as it drew her toward ruin. The echo of point shoes strikes against the wooden floor, a rhythm both delicate and insistent, like the tapping of a distant clock that marks not only time, but the measure of a soul. From the cafes of Paris with their laughter and quarrels, we move into the dim light of a ballet studio, where mirrors line the walls and the scent of resin and sweat lingers in the air. Here, Zelda Fitzgerald pursues a dream that is at once luminous and cruel, the dream of becoming a dancer. It is strange to imagine a woman already celebrated for her presence in society, already the wife of a famous novelist, seeking still another stage upon which to prove herself. Yet perhaps it is not strange at all. For Zelda, life had always been performance, but this was different. Ballet was not about dazzling crowds with spontaneity or scandal. It was about control, discipline, submission of the body to an ideal of form. It was the opposite of the reckless freedom for which she was known, and perhaps that is why it drew her so powerfully. In its strictness, she sought redemption. In its rigors, she sought a purity she could not find elsewhere. Day after day she practiced, sometimes for hours until her muscles trembled and her feet blistered. She was no longer young by the standards of professional ballet, and this late pursuit was itself a rebellion against the body's natural limits. But Zelda refused to accept limits. She demanded from herself the impossible, as if to prove to Scott, to the world, and perhaps most of all to herself, that she was more than muse, more than symbol. She would not only inspire art, she would create it through her own body, through sweat and pain, through the perfection of movement. Scott, however, was bewildered, then resentful. To him, ballet was a threat, a rival that consumed her energy and attention, leaving less for him and his work. He mocked her devotion, dismissed her ambition, and accused her of neglecting her role as wife and companion. Their quarrels deepened, sharp words cutting as cruelly as any blade. Yet Zelda did not relent. She continued to dance, driven by an inner necessity that no argument could extinguish. It was as though she believed that in the strict patterns of ballet, she could recover the self that had been blurred and fragmented by Scott's appropriation of her life. One imagines her standing before the mirror, her body lean and straining, her arms raised in a graceful arc. In the glass, she sees not only her reflection, but also the shadows of her past. The carefree girl from Montgomery, the reckless flapper of New York, the painted figure of Scott's novels. Now she seeks to replace those images with one of her own making, Zelda the dancer, disciplined, independent, sovereign. But mirrors, for all their clarity, also distort. They reflect what is there, but they cannot tell what is real. Did Zelda truly find herself in those reflections, or did she lose herself still further in the endless pursuit of an ideal she could never reach? The Paris years grew heavier as her obsession with ballet intensified. Her health began to falter under the strain. Friends watched with unease as she pushed her body beyond endurance, as if compelled by some inner voice that would not allow her rest. Scott's drinking worsened, his jealousy deepened, and their quarrels spilled over into public scenes that shocked even the jaded expatriates who had grown accustomed to their volatility. The brilliance of their early years together seemed now to harden into something more brittle, more dangerous. And yet, for Zelda, the dance was not madness but necessity. She once wrote that she wished to live in a world where people moved as beautifully as they dreamed. Ballet was her attempt to inhabit such a world, to transform the chaos of her life into the order of movement, the wildness of her soul into the symmetry of art. But perfection is merciless, and the human body is fragile. The more she pursued the ideal, the further it seemed to retreat, until pursuit itself became torment. Scott, meanwhile, could not understand this torment. To him, her devotion seemed irrational, destructive, even cruel to their marriage. He saw her thinness, her exhaustion, her detachment, and he feared, not for her, but for himself, for the stability of his life and his art. His solution was not compassion but criticism, not support but opposition. He argued, he forbade, he accused. And Zelda in turn resisted with equal force, her independence sharpened by his control. In the quiet of the studio, when the quarrels fell away, there remained only the sound of her shoes against the floor, the faint music of a piano, the rhythm of her breath. Those who saw her dance said she possessed a strange quality, not the precision of a professional, but a kind of raw intensity that made her movements unforgettable. She may never have been destined for the stage of the Paris Opera, but in her striving there was something greater than success. There was the pure, desperate need of a soul to be free. But freedom, too, carries its dangers. The body can break. The mind can fracture. The endless hours, the strain, the quarrels, the jealousy, they all pressed upon her until something within began to crack. By the late 1920s, Zelda's pursuit of ballet had begun to spiral into collapse, her health deteriorating, her mind unsteady. The rhythm of the shoes against the floor grew erratic, faltering, until at last they fell silent. And in that silence came another sound, the closing of hospital doors, the locking of gates, the beginning of her long battle with mental illness. The dance had carried her as far as it could, and now it gave way to something darker, more confining. The point shoes, Once instruments of grace hung unused, their satin dulled, their ribbons frayed. Their echo lingers, fading into the distance, until only the memory remains, a woman chasing perfection until it consumed her. The shoes strike once more in memory, then stop. The silence that follows is heavy, broken only by the distant creak of iron, the sound of gates closing, the echo of a lock turning in its place. From that sound begins the next chapter of her story, the chapter of illness and confinement, of institutions and misunderstandings, of a soul caught between freedom and captivity. The gates close with a groan of iron, their lock turning with a sound too final for a spirit that once danced so freely. The echo of Zelda's point shoes fades into silence, replaced now by the echo of footsteps in sterile corridors, the rustle of nurses' skirts, the soft clink of keys at a belt. Thus begins the season of confinement, the years when Zelda Fitzgerald's restless soul was pressed against the walls of institutions, when the world named her not as dancer or writer, not as flapper or muse, but as patient. Her first collapse came in 1930 after the long strain of her Paris years, after the relentless pursuit of ballet had burned her body and mind beyond endurance. In the clinic at Prangons, on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, Zelda was admitted under the care of psychiatrists who studied her with fascination and unease. The diagnosis was schizophrenia, a word that at that time carried more mystery than clarity, more stigma than understanding. She was only 29, still young, still beautiful, yet now marked with the label of madness, a label that would follow her all her life. The days in the clinic were ordered and repetitive, designed to soothe but often suffocating. Patients rose at certain hours, ate at certain times, were walked in gardens, and put to bed like children. To Zelda, who had lived by spontaneity and fire, this routine must have felt like death in slow motion. She wrote letters to Scott filled with longing and bitterness, accusing him of abandonment, pleading for recognition, asserting her sanity even as she described her turmoil. He, in turn, visited, quarreled, wrote to doctors, drank, and tried to shape her story into something he could understand. Between them stretched the gulf of misunderstanding. Scott, ever the author, sought to interpret her breakdown as material, something to be woven into his novels, while Zelda sought to interpret it as evidence of her own thwarted creativity, the price of a spirit denied its true voice. She told her doctors that her illness was not madness, but the inevitable result of living in Scott's shadow, of being denied her own art. She insisted she was a writer, a dancer, a painter, anything but merely his muse. And in these assertions one glimpses both her defiance and her desperation, her need to be seen as more than reflection. At Prangons, Zelda began to write with fervor. In just 6 weeks she completed a novel, Save Me the Waltz, drawing directly from her own experiences, her marriage, her obsession with dance. The words poured out of her, as though her confinement had forced her to channel all her energies into creation. The novel was raw, flawed, but deeply alive, a voice breaking through the silence imposed upon her. When Scott read it, he was furious. He accused her of stealing material from his own unfinished book, of trespassing upon his territory as a writer. The quarrel was bitter, prolonged, cruel. He demanded revisions. He fought with her publishers. He sought to control the narrative once again. Zelda's voice, at the very moment it sought independence, was pulled back into the orbit of his. One can picture her at a desk in the clinic, the window open to the cool air of Lake Geneva, her hand moving swiftly across the page. Outside, the water shimmers in the sunlight, calm and indifferent. Inside, Zelda writes as though her life depends upon it, and perhaps it does. For in writing she asserts her existence, her autonomy, her refusal to be erased. The doctors call it therapy. Scott calls it betrayal. Zelda calls it art. Who among them is right? Or are all of them wrong, each unable to see the fullness of her struggle? The years that followed were marked by a cycle of partial recoveries and relapses, of transfers between hospitals in Switzerland, France, and later America. Each new institution promised healing, yet each carried the same walls, the same locked gates, the same routines that dulled more than they restored. Zelda's letters during these years are filled with longing for freedom, for creativity, for recognition. She wrote of being misunderstood, of being silenced, of being trapped. And yet she also wrote with clarity and wit, her words filled with the same spark that had once made her the darling of the jazz age. Madness and brilliance intertwined in her, inseparable, indivisible. Scott, meanwhile, grew increasingly distant. His drinking worsened, his career faltered, and his resentment toward Zelda deepened. He blamed her for his failures, for his inability to write as he once had, for the weight of responsibility he felt in caring for her. Yet even in his cruelty, he remained bound to her, unable to sever the tie that had defined them both. Their letters from this period are filled with recrimination, but also with echoes of love, as though beneath the anger there remained a thread that neither could cut. It is tempting to see Zelda's breakdowns only as tragedy, as the sad unraveling of a brilliant woman. But there is another way to see them, as the inevitable cost of a soul that burned too fiercely against the constraints of her world. In a time when women were still expected to serve quietly, Zelda demanded to be seen, to be heard, to be recognized as equal in creativity and passion. Was her madness not also a form of protest, a refusal to accept a role too small for her spirit? Or was it, as Scott and the doctors believed, a disorder, an illness, something that stole her from herself? The answer remains elusive, shimmering like the surface of the lake where she once walked in the clinic gardens, calm on the outside, turbulent beneath. The hospital gates remain closed, their locks firm, their keys heavy in the pockets of others. Zelda paces within, her mind alive with images, with words, with music only she can hear. Outside, the world moves on, the jazz age begins to fade, the glitter of the 20s dims into the shadows of depression. But inside, Zelda remains restless, her spirit pressing against the walls, her words scratching across paper, her art struggling to breathe. The sound of those locked gates lingers still, but now, in the distance, another sound rises, the faint flicker of a flame, the glow of a candle placed upon a desk, the scratch of a pen across paper. For Scott continues to write, drawing upon the life they shared, shaping her presence into his fiction, capturing her again and again. And so the story moves from Zelda's confinement to Scott's fame, from her silence to his voice, from the locked gate to the flickering light of a candle, burning low. The candle flickers on a desk, its flame bending with the draft of a half-open window, smoke curling upward in a thin thread that seems fragile, yet persists. This flame belongs not to Zelda, locked behind gates and wandering hospital gardens, but to Scott, who sits late into the night, his typewriter silent for a moment, his pen in hand, his mind turning the fragments of their life into fiction. The candle burns low, but he continues, for words remain his weapon, his refuge, his proof that the world still needs him. As Zelda struggled in clinics along the shores of Europe, Scott pressed forward with his writing, building upon the fame that had first lifted him out of obscurity. The Beautiful and Damned followed his debut, then The Great Gatsby, a novel now hailed as his masterpiece, but at the time received with more muted applause than he had hoped. In each of these works, the reader encounters women who are beautiful, elusive, destructive, women who shimmer with vitality, yet leave men broken in their wake. Again and again, these women are reflections of Zelda, transformed into art, stripped of context, frozen into characters. Daisy Buchanan, Gloria Gilbert, Nicole Diver, all bear within them pieces of Zelda, sometimes her wit, sometimes her defiance, sometimes her fragility. For Scott, art was impossible without life, and life for him was impossible without Zelda. She was his muse and his subject, his inspiration and his torment. Yet what does it mean to live as a muse? To see oneself reflected in the mirror of another's imagination, never whole, always refracted. For Zelda, it meant erasure as much as immortality. She recognized herself in his words, and while part of her delighted in the recognition, another part recoiled. She accused him of stealing her diary, of lifting passages from her letters, of shaping her words into his own. She saw herself again and again, yet never as she truly was, always filtered through his need for art. Friends who observed them in Paris and on the Riviera spoke of this tension. To some, Scott was the genius, Zelda the destabilizing force who threatened his work. To others, Zelda was the unacknowledged artist, silenced and overshadowed by a husband who could not bear competition. In truth, the story was more complicated, for both were brilliant, both fragile, both destructive in their own ways. But history remembers through books, and Scott's books survived, while Zelda's voice struggled to be heard, and so the candle flickered on, its smoke rising as he poured their quarrels, their parties, their despair into sentences. Even when she was absent, confined to clinics, she was present in his pages, haunting his imagination, shaping his characters. Her absence became another form of presence, her silence another kind of voice. He could not write without her. She could not live without resisting him. Their bond was both chain and lifeline, destructive yet inescapable. It is tempting now to see the great Gatsby as the shining pinnacle of his career. But for Scott, it was a disappointment. The reviews were respectful, but sales were modest, and he feared that his moment was already fading. He turned then to short stories for magazines, churning out pieces that brought money but left him dissatisfied. Zelda, meanwhile, felt increasingly trapped, her illness deepening, her ambitions thwarted. The balance between them grew more bitter. He resented her confinement, the financial and emotional burden it placed upon him. She resented his fame, the theft of her life into his fiction. Their love, once a blaze that dazzled the world, had become a fire that consumed them privately. Yet for all his bitterness, Scott never escaped Zelda's shadow. He was a writer, obsessed with memory, with the irretrievable past, with the gap between dream and reality. And in that obsession, Zelda was central. She embodied for him the glamour and the destruction of youth, the promise of happiness always just beyond reach. Without her, his words might have lacked their radiance. With her, they carried the weight of tragedy. It is a paradox. She gave him his art even as the art took her from herself. Imagine Scott in a Parisian apartment, the candle nearly spent, his hand cramped from writing. Outside, the city murmurs with music and voices, but he hears only the whisper of Zelda's presence in his mind. He recalls her laughter, her defiance, her dancing feet, her sharp words, her tears. He shapes them into sentences, believing he is creating art, perhaps not realizing, or perhaps knowing all too well, that he is consuming her once again. The candle flame wavers, then straightens, then wavers again, as if uncertain whether to endure or die. For Zelda, the knowledge of her reflection in his art was unbearable at times. To read oneself in fiction is to confront an image both familiar and false. She knew that his characters, adored by readers, were drawn from her, yet she remained unseen as herself. It is no wonder she sought her own forms of creation, painting, dancing, writing, as if to wrest back from him the right to define her own life. But in the contest between them, Scott had the world's ear, and Zelda was left unheard. her work scattered, her reputation clouded by the word madness. The candle burns lower still, the wax pooling, the smoke rising. Its light flickers across pages filled with ink, across a man weary and uncertain, across the memory of a woman who dances still in his imagination. The flame does not go out yet, but its weakness is evident. And in its trembling glow, we move from the triumph of his words to the fragile assertion of hers, from the novels that made him famous to the book she fought to write in her own voice. The flame gutters once, then steadies, then gutters again, until at last the candle dies, leaving only a wisp of smoke in the air. That smoke drifts across the room, across the years, and settles upon a table where a manuscript lies waiting, a novel written in haste and in passion, its pages filled with Zelda's own words, her own voice. The manuscript rests in silence, daring to speak, daring to exist. It is here that her story gathers again, not as muse but as author, not as inspiration but as creator. The smoke of Scott's candle becomes the breath that turns the first page of Save Me the Waltz. The smoke curls upward from the extinguished candle and drifts across the room like a wandering spirit. It thins, fades, then seems to breathe again, as though taken into living lungs. And with that breath, the silence of a hospital room in Switzerland is broken by the scratch of a pen across paper. Zelda Fitzgerald, confined and watched, bends over a desk with her hair falling loose around her face. Her hand moves quickly, urgently, as if the words themselves cannot wait, as if they are spilling from her body faster than she can contain them. It is here, in the white-walled quiet of Prangen's clinic, that she writes her novel, Save Me the Waltz. She begins it in October of 1931 and completes it in just 6 weeks, a torrent of creation that seems less like deliberate authorship and more like a flood, long dammed. Page after page fills with her own vision of her marriage, her dance, her longing. The novel tells the story of Alabama Beggs, a Southern girl who marries a young artist, follows him into the glare of success, and then struggles to claim an art of her own through the discipline of ballet. It is a mirror, and yet not a mirror, a truth, and yet not a truth. For Zelda does what all artists do. She transforms life into fiction. But the resemblance is clear enough that no one could mistake her subject. It is her life, her marriage, her struggle, laid bare in words. The act of writing is more than literary. For Zelda, it is survival, a reclamation of self. For years, she had watched Scott transform her into characters that the world admired while she remained unseen. Now, for the first time, she seized the pen and said, "This is my story, told in my voice, not his." The prose is strange, at times chaotic, lyrical, filled with unexpected images. Critics later would call it uneven, even incoherent, but there is a fierce originality in it, a refusal to imitate the polished rhythms of her husband. It is as though she has found a new language, one that stumbles but sings, one that strains but speaks truth. When Scott discovered the manuscript, he erupted. To him, it was betrayal. He accused her of plundering the very material he was saving for his own novel, Tender is the Night. He read her words not as an act of survival, but as trespass upon his territory. Letters flew between them, filled with accusation and anguish. He demanded she revise. He insisted on changes. He wrote to her publisher in fury. For a woman already fragile, already battling the voices of doctors and confinement, this resistance from her husband must have cut like glass. Yet she did not withdraw. The novel was published in 1932, her only completed book, her one great claim to authorship. It was received with modest interest, its reviews respectful but cool, its sales poor. Compared to Scott's novels, it seemed small, yet in truth it was vast. for within its pages resided the testament of a woman fighting to assert her identity against overwhelming forces. Some read it then as the curious work of a patient, a clinical document more than literature. Only later would others return to it and see in its fractured beauty the voice of an artist too long dismissed. But for Zelda, the act itself mattered. To have spoken once in her own voice, to have broken the silence, was itself a kind of victory. Picture her in the clinic after the book's completion, the manuscript bound, the struggle over. She sits quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant. The doctors discuss her case. Scott fumes in letters. The world shrugs. Yet within her there must have been, if only for a moment, a sense of release. She had given shape to her own story. She had written herself into being, but the triumph was fragile. The quarrels with Scott over the book deepened their estrangement. He resented her intrusion into his world. She resented his attempt to silence hers. Their daughter, Scotty, watched from afar as her parents tore at one another through distance and letters, their love tangled with cruelty. Zelda's health faltered again, her mind wavering, her spirit exhausted. The hospital gates closed once more around her, and the brief freedom of authorship gave way again to confinement. Yet even in confinement, Zelda never ceased to create. She turned to painting, filling canvases with bright colors and whimsical figures, images both childlike and haunting. She wrote stories and essays, though few were published. She sketched, she embroidered, she decorated, as if art itself were her only means of endurance. Each act of creation was both protest and solace, a way of saying, I am still here. Scott, meanwhile, worked on Tender as the Night, published in 1934. It was hailed as brilliant, though some critics found it disjointed. Within its pages lived yet another portrait of Zelda, transformed into the character Nicole Diver, whose beauty, illness, and marriage to a brilliant but troubled man echoed their life together. Thus, once again, her experience was captured by him, reshaped, immortalized in his words. And so the cycle continued. She created. He resisted. He created. She recognized herself and raged. Between them lay not only love, but a constant struggle over authorship of their shared life. The manuscript of Save Me the Waltz rests still on a table in imagination, its pages faintly yellowing, its voice trembling but insistent. It did not change the world in its time, but it remains as evidence of a woman's determination to speak. To read it now is to hear her directly, unfiltered by her husband, unshaped by his art. It is uneven, yes, but in its unevenness there is honesty, a rawness that polished prose could never convey. As the pages lie still, the air stirs. The sound of footsteps returns, heavy and echoing down the halls of institutions. The manuscript is closed, put aside, as Zelda herself is once again confined, her body frail, her mind unsteady. The world beyond continues without her, the jazz age gone, the depression deepening, her husband moving restlessly in pursuit of money and fame. She remains behind walls, her novel her one fragile monument. The pages rustle faintly as if caught by a passing draft, then fall silent. The silence deepens until only another sound emerges. Footsteps in a hallway, deliberate, echoing, carrying with them the weight of distance and confinement. It is on those footsteps we leave her, and it is upon those footsteps we enter the next stage of her life, the years of breakdown and separation, the widening gulf between husband and wife, father and daughter, artist and muse. The footsteps echo in the long hospital hallway, measured and hollow, each strike upon the linoleum carrying the sound of distance, of absence, of lives divided by walls. The manuscript of Save Me the Waltz lies behind, pages still and forgotten, while Zelda herself walks these halls under watch, her movements monitored, her freedom confined. She is no longer the girl who climbed trees in Montgomery, nor the flapper who startled New York, nor even the dancer who pursued perfection in Paris. She's a patient now, a word spoken quietly in corridors, a word that diminishes as much as it describes. Her breakdowns grew more frequent through the 1930s. The fierce energy that once propelled her into art and rebellion now turned inward, consuming her with voices, obsessions, and despair. Doctors spoke of schizophrenia, though the meaning of that word was then so blurred that it served as much as a label as a diagnosis. She experienced hallucinations, delusions of grandeur, fears of betrayal. Yet beneath these symptoms, she continued to write, to paint, to insist on her own vision of life. Madness and creation walked side by side within her, inseparable companions. Scott, for his part, drifted further away. His visits became less frequent, his letters shorter, his patience thinner. He loved her still in his own way, but his love was wrapped in resentment, in weariness, in the exhaustion of years of quarrels and disappointments. He wrote to doctors demanding updates. He argued over treatments. He sought explanations, but he could not bear the daily weight of her illness. More and more, he left her in the hands of institutions while he pursued his own battles in America, seeking money through magazine stories and struggling with his own drinking. For Zelda, the greatest sorrow was not only the loss of freedom, but the distance from her daughter, Scotty. She had once sung lullabies to the little girl in Paris apartments, once held her close on train journeys through Europe, once tried to create for her the semblance of a normal childhood amid chaos. But as her illness deepened, she saw less and less of her child. Scott took responsibility for raising Scotty, sending her to boarding schools, guiding her future with the same mixture of love and control that had marked his marriage. Zelda longed for her daughter, wrote letters, dreamed of reunions, yet the distance remained. For a child, how difficult it must have been to understand that a mother's absence was not neglect, but illness, not abandonment, but confinement. In the institutions, Zelda often filled her days with small acts of creation. She painted with whatever materials she could find, covering paper with bright, childlike images of flowers, dancers, animals. She embroidered, she decorated, she wrote fragments of stories and plays. Nurses and doctors sometimes dismiss these as symptoms, therapeutic exercises rather than art. But for Zelda, they were lifelines, evidence that her spirit had not been extinguished. She refused to disappear into the silence of patienthood. Each stroke of color, each line of text was a quiet rebellion. Yet the world outside her walls moved on without her. The Jazz Age was gone. The Great Depression had reshaped America. The lights of Paris had dimmed. Friends who had once crowded their parties now scattered, some to fame, some to obscurity, some to graves. Hemingway wrote his novels and dismissed Zelda in his pages with cruelty. Gertrude Stein moved within her salons. But Zelda remained, largely unseen, her name mentioned now less as muse and more as cautionary tale. The world that once celebrated her as the first flapper now remembered her mostly as the mad wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Imagine her walking down the hospital corridor, the footsteps still echoing, her gown brushing softly against her legs. She pauses at a window where the glass is barred, and she looks out at the garden beyond, at trees swaying in the wind, at a bird lifting itself easily into the sky. For a moment she closes her eyes and feels again the Alabama heat of her youth, the river against her skin, the scent of magnolias. Memory itself becomes a form of freedom, though fleeting. Then she opens her eyes and the bars remain. The separation from Scott grew final as the decade deepened. Though they never divorced, their lives diverged completely. He moved to America, trying and failing to conquer Hollywood, living with another woman, fighting his own despair. She remained in institutions in Europe, then in the United States under the watch of doctors who sought to manage rather than to cure. Letters between them continued, sometimes tender, often bitter. In them, one hears not only love and anger, but also exhaustion, as though both knew that the fire that once bound them had burned too long, too fiercely, leaving only smoke. And still, Zelda persisted. Her writings from this time are fragmented, lyrical, filled with strange images. She wrote plays that were never performed, essays that were never published, diaries that vanished into archives. She painted canvases of dreamlike figures, their faces at once innocent and haunted. Even confined, she created worlds. Yet the world beyond her did not listen. Publishers turned away. Critics dismissed her. Friends pitied her. She was seen not as artist, but as patient, not as voice, but as echo. The hospital corridor grows quieter now, the footsteps fading, the air heavy with silence. Zelda sits again at a desk, pen in hand, the bars of the window behind her. The page remains blank for a long time before she begins to write, each word pulled from depths few could imagine. These are not the words of madness, nor of health, but of a life lived in extremes, a life too large for the categories the world insisted upon. The footsteps return, faintly, then fade once more. The silence grows heavy, broken at last by another sound, the clatter of a typewriter in another room, far away, struck with urgency and weariness. It is not Zelda's typewriter, but Scott's, his keys jamming, his sentences faltering, his career unraveling. From the quiet corridors of Zelda's confinement, we move now to the noise of Scott's decline, his struggles in Hollywood, his drinking, his distance from the wife who still haunted him. The echo of footsteps gives way to the clatter of a typewriter that will soon fall silent. The typewriter stammers, its carriage jamming, the keys striking awkwardly before falling still. The silence that follows is heavy, broken only by the faint clink of glass as Scott Fitzgerald lifts another drink to his lips in some dim Hollywood apartment. From the echo of Zelda's footsteps in hospital corridors, we pass now to the shuffle of Scott's own decline. A man once crowned the voice of a generation, now struggling to find his place in a world that has shifted away from him. It is the mid-1930s. The jazz age that he had once defined is long gone, swallowed by the Great Depression. The parties of the 20s are remembered not with delight, but with bitterness, their champagne excesses appearing obscene beside breadlines and foreclosures. The public no longer wants stories of gilded youth. It wants tales of endurance, of survival, of grit. Scott, who once dazzled editors with his charm, now struggles to sell stories at all. His name still carries weight, but it is a weight grown heavy with disappointment. He turns to Hollywood, lured by promises of money, of steady work, of another chance. But Hollywood, with its machinery of studios and scripts, has little patience for the delicacy of his art. In Los Angeles, Scott writes screenplays that are rarely produced, edits scripts that others dismiss, sits in offices waiting for meetings that never come. He feels himself diminished, a craftsman forced to carve trinkets instead of monuments. To ease the humiliation, he drinks. To steady himself, he drinks. To forget Zelda's confinement, he drinks. The bottle becomes companion, enemy, necessity. His health declines, his reputation falters, his debts rise. Friends speak of him with pity, some with scorn. He is no longer the golden boy of literature, but a man wandering amid broken dreams. And yet, even in decline, Scott writes. He scribbles notes for a novel about Hollywood, The Last Tycoon, fragments of brilliance scattered across unfinished pages. In these fragments, one glimpses the same sharpness that once created Gatsby, the same lyricism that made him immortal. But the fragments remain incomplete, the novel unfinished, like the man himself. The typewriter jams, the carriage halts, and no hand is steady enough to continue. All the while, Zelda lingers in institutions far away, her letters crossing his desk like ghosts. Their marriage, though long sundered in practice, remains intact on paper. They never divorce, though both know they will never live together again. Their bond endures not as partnership, but as haunting, each carrying the weight of the other, each unable to escape. Scott resents her illness, her demands, the financial strain of her care. Zelda resents his neglect, his betrayals, his theft of her voice. Yet beneath the anger there remains a thread of recognition, a strange loyalty, as though both knew that their identities were bound beyond choice. For their daughter Scotty, this was a time of distance and confusion. She saw her father struggling in California, her mother confined in hospitals, her own life shaped by absence. Scott adored her, wrote her long letters of advice, sought to shape her into the person he hoped she would be. Zelda loved her fiercely too, though from afar, writing letters filled with longing, with strange fragments of wisdom, with echoes of a love she could not fully express in person. The child became the tether between them, though she too lived much of her youth apart, raised by schools and guardians, carrying in her veins the brilliance and the burden of her parents. Imagine Scott in his small Hollywood apartment, the walls thin, the light dim, his typewriter silent. He sits with his head in his hands, the sound of a radio drifting faintly from another room, a popular song that belongs to a world younger than he now feels. On his desk lies a letter from Zelda, her handwriting looping across the page, her words alternately tender and accusatory. He reads it with weariness, with guilt, with a sorrow he cannot name. He pours another drink, though he knows it will not help. The glass clinks against the table, and the sound seems to echo the jammed typewriter, the unfinished sentences, the broken rhythm of his life. And yet, despite everything, Scott never ceased to believe in literature. He still held on to the hope of redemption through art, of one more masterpiece that would restore his name. He worked on The Last Tycoon with a desperate urgency, as though time itself were running out. He wrote letters filled with bravado, insisting that his comeback was near. He dreamed still of immortality, even as mortality pressed closer. For Zelda, far away, the knowledge of his decline was a wound layered upon her own. She had once been blamed for his troubles, accused of sabotaging his career, of draining his genius. Now she watched from confinement as he faltered without her, his own demons consuming him. Did she feel vindicated or only sorrow? In her letters, she wrote of love and recrimination, of longing and anger, of memories that refused to fade. It was as though their marriage, though broken in life, continued endlessly in words, in accusations, in echoes. The typewriter sits silent still, its carriage unmoved, its ribbon dry. Scott lies on his bed in December of 1940, his body weary, his heart straining. Beside him sits Sheila Graham, the woman who cared for him in his last years, who saw in him not the legend of the jazz age, but a man broken yet still noble. A cough shakes him, a pain strikes, and within moments he is gone. 44 years old, dead of a heart attack, his life cut short, his novel unfinished, his legacy uncertain. The news reaches Zelda in the hospital. She receives it with silence, with a calmness that seems almost detached. Perhaps she had long prepared for this moment. Perhaps she had lived with the knowledge that their lives, though bound, would end apart. She writes a brief letter. She prays. She paints. The fire that once bound them both has burned down now to embers, leaving only ash and memory. The jammed typewriter remains, its keys unmoving, its silence heavier than words. The sound of its final clatter fades into another sound, the faint rustle of paper folded but never sent, a letter that lies unfinished on a table. From the silence of Scott's death, we move into Zelda's solitude, into the years when she endured alone, when letters unsent became her companions, when grief settled upon her like dust upon an abandoned room. The letter lies folded on the table, its words half-written, its purpose undone. The ink dries, though no seal is pressed, no address inscribed, no journey begun. It waits in silence like so many of Zelda's own thoughts, prepared, reaching outward, yet never leaving the small circle of her solitude. The folded letter becomes the symbol of the years that followed Scott's death in December 1940, when she, the restless companion of his brilliance, was left to navigate life alone. News of his passing reached her within the walls of Highland Hospital. She received it not with wailing nor collapse, but with a quietness that startled those around her. Some said she prayed, others said she went to her room and painted. Perhaps she did both. Grief, when it arrives upon a soul already long bruised, often enters in silence rather than storm. She had quarreled with him, loved him, hated him, dreamed of him, been imprisoned by him, and inspired him. Their bond had long been more chain than garland, yet with his death a part of her world dissolved, leaving her stranded with memories that could neither be reclaimed nor undone. Scott had died uncertain of his reputation. His books were mostly out of print, his income meager, his reputation tarnished. He believed himself a failure, though history would soon correct that judgment. Zelda, surviving him, knew too well the bitter irony. The man who had consumed her life in art would now be remembered through that art, while she, still alive, remained enclosed within hospital walls, dismissed by most as a tragic footnote. Even in death, Scott overshadowed her. The folded letter of her existence left unread beside the volumes of his celebrated prose. Yet Zelda did not cease to live, nor did she cease to create. In the 1940s, she continued painting with renewed vigor, her canvases filled with colors brighter than the gray corridors of her confinement. She painted saints and angels, biblical scenes infused with whimsy and sorrow, dancers frozen in mid-step, gardens blooming with a strangeness that was both childlike and profound. Her paintings, rarely exhibited in her lifetime, carried within them a world that was hers alone, untouched by Scott's pen, unshaped by any editor's demand. They were as much prayer as art, a testament that her spirit still reached for light despite the weight of illness and memory. In letters, she remained eloquent, her words shimmering with insight and wit. To friends, she wrote of her faith, her reading, her memories, her daughter. She quoted poetry. She recalled dances. She speculated on philosophy. At times, her letters rambled into disjointed images, evidence of her fractured mind. Yet even in fragments, they possessed a peculiar radiance. Reading them is to hear a voice unbroken by confinement, still insisting on being heard, still insisting that she was more than patient, more than widow, more than muse. Her relationship with her daughter, Scotty, remained tender but strained. Scotty, now a young woman, carried her own burdens, the fame and notoriety of her parents, the whispers of their excesses, the pity of those who spoke of Zelda as mad and of Scott as tragic. Yet she loved them both, wrote to them, visited when she could. For Zelda, these visits were both joy and pain, for they reminded her of what might have been, of the family life denied to her by circumstance and illness. She longed to be near her child, to advise her, to share in her triumphs and sorrows. But distance remained, measured not only in miles but in the heavy doors of the hospitals that kept her apart. Still, Zelda found ways to reach outward. She took classes in writing and art during periods when her health improved. She attended church, seeking in faith a refuge from the turbulence of her mind. She dreamed of publishing again, of staging plays, of exhibitions of her paintings. These dreams often faltered before reality, but the dreaming itself was proof of her endurance. To dream is a form of resistance, and Zelda resisted until the end. Imagine her sitting by a window in Highland Hospital, the folded letter beside her, her hands stained faintly with paint. Outside, The North Carolina hills roll gently under a winter sky. She looks at the landscape, but in her mind she sees Montgomery. She sees Paris. She sees New York. Memory becomes a kind of travel, a way of escaping the confinement of walls. She drifts from image to image, hearing again the music of jazz, the applause of parties, the tap of point shoes, the sound of Scott's typewriter clattering late into the night. They come not as torment, but as echoes, reminders that she had lived fully, dangerously, magnificently, even if the world reduced her to silence. The folded letter still waits, its pages sealed by inaction. It is addressed to no one, and yet to everyone. Perhaps it is meant for Scott, perhaps for Scotty, perhaps for the future itself. In that unfinished page lies the essence of Zelda's later life, the sense of a voice cut short, the sense of words left unsent. And yet, even folded, the letter exists. It testifies to the attempt to speak, to the effort to connect, to the refusal to vanish into complete silence. As the years passed, Zelda remained at Highland more often than not, though she sometimes returned to Montgomery for visits. In those visits, she walked the streets of her youth, now older, quieter, carrying with her the shadows of decades. Some who saw her then remarked on her gentleness, her eccentricity, her enduring grace. Others saw only tragedy. But Zelda herself, in her writings, revealed neither despair nor bitterness as her final word. Instead, she spoke often of faith, of forgiveness, of the need to endure. In her quiet, she found a kind of peace, though it was fragile, always at risk of being broken by the weight of memory. The folded letter lies still upon the table. Its edges curl slightly with time, its ink faded. The silence around it deepens until it seems that no one will ever open it. Then, faintly, the air stirs, rustling its pages, carrying the sound of a brush against canvas, the sound of colors mixing, the sound of dreams taking shape in paint rather than in words. The letter remains unsent, but the painting on the easel begins, its colors speaking where words could not. From the silence of the folded page, we move into the unfinished image on the canvas, where Zelda's art continues to speak in bright, trembling hues. The folded letter rests quietly on the table, its words unsent, but beside it, another sound rises, softer yet more insistent. The whisper of bristles moving across canvas, the blending of pigment with oil, the breath of color taking form beneath a hand that trembles, yet refuses to stop. In this sound lies the continuation of Zelda Fitzgerald's life, the persistence of her creativity, long after the world had decided to turn away. If her words had been folded into silence, her paintings remained open, unguarded, unfinished but radiant. During the 1940s, while confined at Highland Hospital or during brief periods of return to Montgomery, Zelda painted with an intensity that seemed to match, if not replace, the lost rhythms of her dance and the fractured streams of her writing. Her canvases bore strange, whimsical figures, angels with outstretched wings, saints adorned with colors that glowed brighter than any cathedral's stained glass, children skipping through dreamlike gardens, dancers whose movements were frozen in mid-leap as if eternity had paused to watch. There was innocence in these works, but also a haunting undertone, as though each playful figure carried within it the weight of sorrow. Each bright color concealed the shadow of confinement. Her style was unlike the disciplined schools of art she might have studied in Paris. It was more intuitive, more naive, yet deeply personal. Critics who have looked upon her surviving works often speak of them as visionary folk art, pieces that defy technical polish, yet speak with a voice entirely her own. For Zelda, who had been overshadowed all her life by Scott's mastery of language, painting offered a medium untouched by his shadow, a field where she could speak without interference. With each brushstroke, she reclaimed space. She declared her persistence. She breathed color into the silence. Imagine her in a quiet room at Highland, the walls bare, the light from a high window falling across her easel. Around her, the hospital hums with routine, the shuffle of nurses, the ring of bells, the clatter of trays. Yet within the circle of her canvas, she creates a world apart. The blue of the sky she paints is brighter than the window above her, the figures she sketches more alive than those around her. She dips her brush again, presses color into form, and in that act, she is no longer a patient, but an artist, her hand steady with purpose. She painted not only religious figures, but also images drawn from her own memories. Dancers appear again and again in her canvases, reminders of the years when she had pursued ballet until her body broke. Children, too, often populate her paintings, perhaps echoes of Scotty, perhaps of her own lost innocence, perhaps symbols of the self she still longed to nurture. In one canvas, bright and chaotic, a circus unfolds, filled with acrobats and animals, their eyes wide with wonder. In another, saints hover above a landscape of surreal colors, their halos glowing like suns. Always there is this blend of joy and unease, of celebration and melancholy. It is as though Zelda poured her fractured self onto the canvas, refusing to hide either the light or the darkness. Her art was rarely shown publicly in her lifetime. A few exhibitions were arranged, often small, often overlooked. Critics were polite, sometimes curious, but the art world did not rush to embrace her. She remained, in their eyes, the troubled wife of a famous man, her paintings viewed as the eccentric hobby of a patient rather than the serious work of an artist. Yet Zelda continued nonetheless. For her, painting was not about acclaim, but about survival. Each line, each color, each unfinished canvas was proof that she had not been erased. Even within her family, opinions differed. Scotty admired her mother's talent, but also feared the instability that seemed to accompany it. Friends saw in the paintings evidence of both brilliance and madness, unable to separate the two. And perhaps they were inseparable, for Zelda's art emerged not despite her suffering, but through it. The images are not the work of a mind at peace, but of a mind that refused to be silenced, a soul that insisted upon expression even when caged. In the act of painting, Zelda also found a form of prayer. Her religious works reveal a yearning for transcendence, for a connection to something beyond the turbulence of her mind. The saints and angels she painted seem less like figures of distant holiness than companions in her struggle, beings who hovered close to comfort her, to remind her that she was not entirely alone. Her brush moved with devotion, creating sanctuaries on canvas even when the rooms she lived in were bare. And yet, as with so much in her life, the art remained unfinished. Many canvases were left incomplete, abandoned when her health failed or when she was moved from place to place. Some survive today, their edges frayed, their surfaces cracked, their images frozen mid-gesture. They are artifacts of a struggle, fragments of a voice that sought always to rise but was so often interrupted. To stand before one is to feel not only her vision, but also her absence, the weight of all she might have created, had life allowed her the freedom to do so. The unfinished painting upon the easel is like the folded letter upon the table. Both are incomplete, both are testaments to the attempt to speak, both are reminders of how much of Zelda's life remained unsaid. And yet, in their incompleteness, they possess a strange power, for they point not to failure but to persistence. They say, "I tried. I kept trying. I would not be silent." The brush lingers on the canvas, the color still wet, the figure half-formed. The air in the room grows heavy with the scent of turpentine, with the faint must of hospital walls. Outside in Montgomery, cicadas hum in the twilight, their song unending, their rhythm ancient. The painting stands unfinished, the brush resting, and into that pause drifts the sound of cicadas, carrying us away from the hospital room and back toward the south, back to the streets of Zelda's youth, where memory and time circle once more. The cicadas hum in the southern twilight, their sound swelling like the very breath of the land, ancient and unbroken, rising and falling in waves that seem to carry memory itself. From the unfinished painting in the hospital room, we drift now into Montgomery once more, into the city where Zelda's restless spirit first awakened. Time has turned, years have passed, yet here she returns in her later days, no longer the wild girl who shocked its dances and paraded barefoot across its lawns, but a woman marked by illness and endurance, carrying with her the shadows of decades. The return to Montgomery was not triumph, but necessity. Highland Hospital, though her frequent refuge, was not her only home. Periods of remission, visits to family, and attempts to anchor herself brought her back to the town that had once both confined and shaped her. Walking its streets again, Zelda must have felt the strange dissonance of familiarity and estrangement. The magnolia trees still spread their branches heavy with scent. The river still moved sluggishly beneath the heat. The porches still echoed with the sound of rocking chairs in the evening. Yet the girl who had once climbed those trees swum that river, and mocked those porches was long gone, replaced by a woman the town could scarcely comprehend. Her family, especially her mother Minnie, offered a place of rest, though not always of understanding. For them, Zelda was both beloved and bewildering. They recalled the vivacious child she had been, but now they saw her with the fragile composure of one who had suffered too much. Conversations at the dinner table carried silences, pauses, in which memory and sorrow mingled. The South itself, with its insistence on appearances, on whispered judgments, found it easier to speak of her fame as Scott's wife than to confront the reality of her struggles. And so Zelda lived once more in a place of paradox, welcomed yet distanced, remembered yet misremembered, home yet foreign. Montgomery in the 1940s was no longer the Montgomery of her youth. The war abroad had changed the rhythms of the town, and the old codes of Southern society had begun to shift, though slowly. Zelda, walking through its streets, must have felt time pressing upon her, as though the years had folded back and forward all at once. She could see herself at 17, radiant and untamed, yet she also saw herself as she was now, older, thinner, carrying the weight of loss. The cicadas sang the same as they always had, indifferent to the passage of human lives. In these visits, Zelda often painted. Her canvases of this period reflect the southern landscape: bright flowers, winding rivers, children playing in fields. Yet even in these seemingly gentle scenes, one finds undertones of strangeness, of sadness. Ours, the colors are vivid but unsettling, the face is innocent but slightly haunted. It is as though Montgomery itself, filtered through Zelda's vision, became both paradise and prison, a place of childhood delight and adult confinement. She could not return as the girl she had been. She could only transform the town into art, capturing its beauty while revealing its shadows. At times she wrote letters from Montgomery, letters that reveal both longing and detachment. She spoke of the heat, of family, of the quiet rhythms of the South, yet also of her yearning to create, to be recognized, to be more than what she was remembered as. She watched Scotty's life unfold from afar, proud of her daughter's accomplishments, saddened by the distance that illness and circumstance had placed between them. To Zelda, the greatest tragedy was not her own confinement, but the gap it created between her and the child she loved. Walking past her old haunts, the Capitol, the country club, the wide lawns, Zelda might have asked herself what had changed more, the town or herself. Did the people who saw her remember the fearless flapper, or did they see only the patient returned home under watch? Did she herself remember with pride or with sorrow? Memory is never singular. It bends under the weight of longing, reshaping itself with each recollection. The Montgomery she returned to was not the one she had left, and the Zelda who returned was not the one who had departed. Imagine her in the southern dusk, standing on the porch of her family's house, the cicadas' chorus swelling around her. She leans against the wooden railing, the air heavy with jasmine, the sky turning violet. She remembers the dances, the laughter, the bold defiance of youth. She remembers the train whistle that once carried her away. Now the sound is gone, and in its place is only the drone of insects, steady, eternal. For a moment she smiles, touched by the strange peace of continuity, yet beneath the smile lies the ache of all that was lost. Montgomery provided rest, but not resolution. Zelda would not remain there permanently. She drifted back again to Highland, back again to the cycles of treatment and confinement. Yet her returns to Alabama remained significant, reminders of her origins, opportunities to stand once more in the place where her spirit had first declared itself. They were visits that stitched together the fabric of her life, connecting the restless child to the weary woman, the beginning to the nearing end. The cicadas continue their song, unbroken, unhurried. Their rhythm fills the night, as though to remind her that time is both fleeting and eternal, that lives come and go, but the earth endures. Their hum becomes a lullaby, carrying her memories into the night air. The porch creaks softly under her weight, and somewhere inside the house a door closes gently, shutting her in, shutting her out. That sound of the door, quiet yet final, will carry us into the next part of her story, into her tender, strained, and complicated relationship with the daughter who was both her anchor and her sorrow. The door closes softly, a hush of wood upon wood, a sound that lingers in the air like a sigh, neither final nor loud, but carrying with it a sense of separation. From that sound we move into the delicate chamber of Zelda's heart, where her daughter, Frances Scotty Fitzgerald, resides. If Scott had been her mirror, reflecting and reshaping her image until she could scarcely recognize herself, then Scotty was her tether, the fragile line that connected her to life, to hope, to the possibility of redemption. Yet even this bond was strained, complicated by absence, by illness, by distance that neither love nor longing could fully close. Zelda adored her daughter. From the first moment she spoke of her with pride, with delight, with a tenderness that few glimpses of her life otherwise reveal. In photographs one sees Zelda's arms wrapped around the child, her gaze softer than it ever was in public, her smile less defiant, more inward. She wanted, perhaps more than anything, to be the mother she herself had never imagined she could become. Loving, playful, present, and in her own way, she was. But the chaos of her marriage, the demands of Scott's career, and her own spirals into illness made presence difficult and too often impossible. Scotty grew up amid instability, shuttled between apartments, hotels, schools, and guardians. She saw her parents more in fragments than in constancy. Scott's alcoholism and professional struggles made him both attentive and neglectful by turns, a father who gave advice in torrents of letters, yet could disappear into weeks of silence. Zelda, meanwhile, drifted in and out of hospitals, sometimes writing her daughter long, affectionate letters filled with whimsical descriptions and strange metaphors, sometimes unable to see her at all. For a child, such love, intense yet unreliable, must have felt like sunlight fractured by clouds, warm one moment, obscured the next. In her letters to Scotty, Zelda often slipped into the language of dreams. She described gardens and angels. She gave advice couched in poetic turns of phrase. She expressed her pride in Scotty's accomplishments with a flourish of words that were more art than instruction. These letters, when read now, seem like gifts, fragile attempts to wrap love in imagery when presence was denied. Yet they also reveal the distance, for a child might wish less for angels and metaphors than for a mother's steady hand at the breakfast table, a voice in the evening, a figure constant in the room. Still, the bond endured. Scotty loved her mother, even as she struggled with the weight of being Zelda Fitzgerald's daughter. The world whispered of her parents' wildness, their scandals, their tragedies. Teachers, friends, strangers, all carried opinions about Scott and Zelda, and Scotty bore them whether she wished to or not. She grew up in the long shadow of their fame, a shadow that sometimes protected, sometimes stifled. And yet, within that shadow, she carved a life of her own, proving more balanced, more resilient than many would have expected. For Zelda, watching her daughter grow from afar was both pride and pain. Pride, because Scotty was talented, intelligent, charming. Pain, because she could not be there in the daily rhythms of her life. She missed birthdays, graduations, dances, the quiet moments that make up the fabric of motherhood. Illness had stolen from her the chance to be steady, to be ordinary, to be near. And yet, in her mind, in her art, in her prayers, she held Scotty constantly. The daughter remained her anchor, the living proof that her life had not been only fire and destruction, but also creation. Imagine Zelda writing late at night in Highland Hospital, the walls quiet, the nurses moving softly beyond the door. She writes a letter to Scotty, her words looping across the page. She tells her daughter to be kind, to be brave, to find beauty in the world. She compares her to birds, to flowers, to stars. She closes the letter with love, signs it, folds it carefully. Whether it ever reaches Scotty is uncertain, for so many of Zelda's letters remained like the folded pages we have seen before, unsent, unfinished, intercepted by circumstance. But the act of writing itself was love, a reaching outward, a refusal to let the bond be broken. For Scotty, these gestures were both gift and burden. To be loved so fiercely by a mother one could not always touch must have been confusing, even overwhelming. To read such words, filled with brilliance but also tinged with the shadow of illness, must have left her both proud and uncertain. Yet she carried her mother's legacy with dignity, living into her adulthood with steadiness, creating a family, building a career, preserving her parents' memory. It was through Scotty, in many ways, that Zelda and Scott survived into later generations, for without her they might have been remembered only in fragments, in scandal, in whispers. The door that closed softly in Montgomery becomes now a symbol of their relationship, sometimes open, sometimes shut, always between them the barrier of circumstance. Zelda longed to be on the other side, to sit with her daughter, to watch her life unfold. But too often she remained behind doors she could not open, writing letters across the distance, painting angels who might carry her love when she could not. And yet, even in this distance, the connection endured. For love, though strained, can exist across walls, across silences, across absences. Zelda's love for Scotty was not diminished by her illness. It was intensified by it, sharpened into words and images that reached outward even when her body could not. If she failed in constancy, she succeeded in intensity. If she was absent in presence, she was fierce in memory. The door closes once more, the latch catching gently. Behind it, Zelda's voice softens into silence, her figure retreating into the dim rooms of Highland Hospital. Beyond it, Scotty moves forward into her own life, carrying her mother with her in ways she may not even have realized. The separation is quiet, tender, painful. The night deepens, and another sound rises, the steady rhythm of rain against glass, soft and persistent, falling upon the windows of the hospital where Zelda spends her final years. From the closing door, we pass now into the corridors of her last confinement, where rain itself becomes both companion and elegy. The rain falls softly against the window, each drop striking the glass with a rhythm both soothing and unrelenting, a lullaby for those within the hospital walls who have grown used to its sound. For Zelda, the rain at Highland Hospital became a companion in her final years, a steady voice from the outside world that seeped into her room when all else was silence. It was in those late decades, the 1940s leading to the end, that her life narrowed into these corridors. Yet within them she still carried the same restless spirit that had once danced barefoot in Montgomery, swum in rivers, and glittered in New York lights. Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, was a place of routine. Bells marked the hours of meals. Nurses moved through halls with practiced calm. Patients sat in parlors or gardens, according to the weather. For Zelda, whose life had been defined by intensity and disruption, such routine must have been at once prison and balm. The predictability provided structure, but it also enclosed her, denying her the spontaneity she had once thrived upon. She passed days painting, writing, praying, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in the fog of her illness. Each day was much like the last, yet beneath the surface, her mind remained alive, carrying memories, longings, and visions that found their way into her art. In those years, she painted prolifically. Canvases leaned against the walls of her room, filled with angels and saints, dancers and children, gardens filled with dreamlike flowers. Bright colors clashed and mingled. Figures seemed both innocent and haunted. Her faith deepened too, her paintings often touched with religious imagery, as though she sought through art to reach the divine, to reconcile herself to the suffering of her life. Nurses remembered her as quiet, sometimes eccentric, often lost in her work. To them, she was a patient. To herself, she was still an artist, still a seeker of beauty in the midst of confinement. The rain at the window blurred the view of the hills beyond, and in those blurred lines, Zelda must have seen echoes of her past. Perhaps the drip of water on the glass reminded her of Paris in the spring, of New York streets after a summer storm, of Alabama afternoons heavy with thunder. Memory and rain have much in common. They wash over, they obscure, they cleanse, they linger. In the soft percussion against the glass, Zelda might have heard the rhythms of her own past, each drop a note from a life lived at extremes. Visitors came rarely but significantly. Scotty visited when she could, bringing news of her own life, her family, her children. These visits were treasured, even when brief, for they reminded Zelda that she was not entirely forgotten, that the thread between mother and daughter endured. Friends wrote letters, some curious, some kind, some distant. The world beyond Highland was shifting rapidly. War abroad, recovery at home, new generations rising. But within the hospital, Zelda's world remained both timeless and suspended, defined by walls, windows, and the unceasing rhythm of rain. And yet, in her own way, she found peace there. Accounts of her final years suggest a gentleness, a resignation, a quiet faith. She attended chapel services, read scripture, wrote prayers in her notebooks. The fire of her youth had not vanished but had softened, no longer wild defiance but a steady flame of endurance. Her letters from this time reveal reflections on forgiveness, on love, on the persistence of the soul despite the frailties of the body. Madness had been her companion, but so too had resilience. She remained alive to beauty, to memory, to the power of art to give shape to suffering. Imagine her seated by the window on a rainy afternoon, her canvas before her, her brush in hand. The sound of rain fills the room, mingling with the faint smell of turpentine and oil. Outside, the hills roll quietly into the mist. On her canvas, an angel begins to take shape, its wings spread wide, its face serene. She paints not for exhibition, not for critics, not even for family, but for herself, for the act of creation that gives meaning to days otherwise blurred by repetition. In that moment, she is free, not confined by walls or diagnoses, but lifted by her own imagination into a world of color and light. But rain is never endless. It ceases, it returns, it shifts with the weather, reminding those who listen that all rhythms eventually change. For Zelda, too, change would come, though not in the form of release, but of final tragedy. The rain upon the glass, steady and persistent, begins to fade into another sound, the faint crackle of fire, subtle at first, then stronger, a sound that will soon engulf the hospital itself. The rain that had been her companion falls silent in memory, and in its place rises the hiss and roar of flame. The transition is quiet now, still distant, but it approaches, inevitable, waiting at the edge of her story. The rain fades, its rhythm softening, until only memory remains of its gentle percussion on the glass. Out of that silence, another sound emerges. Not of the present, but of voices speaking across time, voices of critics, biographers, strangers, each repeating her name in tones both admiring and dismissive. Zelda Fitzgerald remembered, misremembered, reshaped by those who never knew her. In this echo, we move into the realm of memory itself, into the way history has held her, sometimes gently, sometimes cruelly, never fully true. While Zelda lived, her image had already begun to crystallize in the public imagination. She was the flapper, the wild Southern girl who drank and danced and shocked her elders, the dazzling wife who rode atop taxis and dove into fountains. Journalists adored her for her antics, chronicling her as though she were a living emblem of the jazz age. To them, she was less person than symbol, less woman than trend. And symbols, once fixed, have little room for contradiction. Beneath the laughter, beneath the photographs, the true depth of her struggle was ignored. After her breakdowns and institutionalizations, the image shifted. No longer the darling of New York papers, she became instead the cautionary tale, the mad wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Hemingway painted her as destructive, jealous, dangerous to Scott's genius. Others repeated the diagnosis of schizophrenia without question, reducing her entire existence to an illness. Where once she had been mythologized as the spirit of freedom, now she was mythologized as the specter of madness. Both myths obscured the woman herself. Scott's novels also shaped her memory. Daisy Buchanan, Gloria Gilbert, Nicole Diver, all these characters bore her features, her words, her essence. Readers met Zelda in fiction before they met her in history, and thus she was remembered not as she was, but as Scott imagined her. His art was brilliant, his portrayals unforgettable, but they were fragments of her, not the whole. To live on in literature is to be immortal, yes, but also to be confined to someone else's vision. Zelda became eternal through his words, but she also vanished within them. Yet there were other memories, quieter ones, preserved in her paintings, in her letters, in her unfinished writings. In them, we hear her own voice, playful and strange, lyrical and sharp. She wrote of beauty, of gardens, of her daughter, of longing. She painted angels and children, saints and dancers. These works, overlooked in her lifetime, have since been revisited, seen anew as evidence of her artistry. Critics now recognize what was dismissed before, that Zelda was not merely muse, but creator, not merely patient, but artist. And yet, even this recognition remains partial, for the line between madness and creativity in her legacy is often blurred, as though her work could not be considered without reference to her illness. To be remembered is to be simplified. History prefers clean lines, neat stories. But Zelda was never neat. She was contradiction itself, wild yet disciplined, tender yet sharp, fragile yet defiant. She was muse and artist, flapper and mother, patient and visionary. To insist upon one image at the expense of the others is to betray her. Perhaps that is why her memory remains unsettled, why voices still argue about her, why her name still carries a kind of unease. She refuses, even in death, to be reduced. Imagine the ripple of her memory spreading outward, like water disturbed by a stone. At the center is Zelda herself, alive and complex. Around her, the ripples of memory expand. Scott's novels, Hemingway's accusations, doctors' diagnoses, gossip column stories, her own letters and paintings. Each ripple distorts her, reshapes her, refracts her. Those who stand at the edge of the water see only the shifting circles, never the stone at the center. To reach her, one must dive beneath the surface, through distortion, into depth. And yet, perhaps distortion itself is part of her legacy. For Zelda lived a life that defied clarity, that embraced chaos, that sought extremes. She did not wish to be ordinary, and so she was not remembered as ordinary. She wished to burn brightly, and so she is remembered as a flame, though whether that flame warms or destroys depends on who recalls it. In this way, memory itself becomes a mirror of her life, brilliant, fractured, elusive. Her daughter Scotty worked hard to preserve both parents' legacies, editing their letters, publishing collections, advocating for Scott's recognition as one of America's great novelists. In this work, Zelda, too, was remembered, though often in the margins, her letters presented as accompaniment to his. But slowly, over decades, scholars and readers began to turn their attention to her directly. Save Me the Waltz was reissued, her paintings exhibited, her life re-examined through the lens of feminist critique. New generations asked, was she truly mad, or was she silenced by a society unwilling to accept her defiance? Was she destroyed by illness, or by the weight of a marriage in which her voice was consumed? The questions remain, and perhaps they should, for certainty would diminish her mystery. The rain of history falls unevenly, erasing some names, exaggerating others. Zelda's memory remains both obscured and luminous, her figure appearing and vanishing like a shadow beneath shifting clouds. She is remembered as too much and not enough, as muse and as artist, as symbol and as woman. And in this tension lies her enduring fascination. For who among us is ever remembered as we truly were? Who among us escapes the distortions of those who tell our story after we are gone? The ripple on the water widens, carrying her name further and further until it fades into silence once more. But from that silence rises another sound, harsher than rain, sharper than memory, the crackle of fire, faint at first, then louder, growing until it consumes the quiet entirely. The ripple dissolves into flame, and the final chapter of Zelda's story begins again, as it must, with the blaze that ended her life at Highland Hospital. The ripple dissolves into flame, the shimmer of water giving way to the hiss of fire, faint at first like the crackle of paper in a hearth, then louder, sharper, until the sound fills the night. It is March of 1948 in Asheville, North Carolina, at Highland Hospital, where Zelda Fitzgerald lies asleep in a locked ward. The building, meant to contain illness and restore balance, will instead become her tomb. A small blaze begins in the kitchen, unnoticed, a flicker in the darkness. In moments, the fire climbs the stairwells, licks the timbers, spreads through corridors with a hunger impossible to restrain. For the women in the upper floors, Zelda among them, there is little chance of escape. The windows are barred, the doors locked as a matter of routine. In the logic of the institution, such precautions protect the patients from themselves. On this night, those protections will seal their fate. Smoke thickens in the halls, alarms sound, voices rise in panic. Nurses rush to unlock doors, but the flames move faster than hands, faster than keys. Within minutes, the building is consumed, and 9 women, Zelda among them, are overtaken by fire. It is a cruel ending, one that seems too symbolic, too aligned with the language her life had already invited. For Zelda had been called a flame, a spark, a fire too bright to last. To perish in flame feels like metaphor made literal, as though life itself conspired to reduce her story to a single image. Yet beyond symbol, there is the reality of her final moments. The heat, the smoke, the locked doors, the absence of escape. There is terror here, but also, perhaps, release. For Zelda had long lived behind barriers, hospital gates, locked rooms, the cages of reputation and memory. In fire, those barriers dissolved. Whether she met it with fear or with surrender, no one can say. News of her death reached the world quickly, though not with the thunder one might expect for a woman once crowned as the emblem of an age. The newspapers reported it briefly. Wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald dies in hospital fire. Her name appeared, but her identity was still tethered to his. Even in death, she was defined as muse, as wife, as shadow. Few paused to reflect on what had been lost. The artist, the dancer, the writer, silenced too soon. The world that had once applauded her wildness now regarded her only as tragic. Yet for those who knew her story or glimpsed fragments of her spirit, the fire carried another meaning. It was an ending too violent for dismissal, too stark for erasure. It forced memory to reconsider, to ask again who she had been, to wonder what had been consumed in those flames. A woman who had once electrified rooms with her laughter, who had once defied a town with her freedom, who had once danced until her feet bled. Such a woman could not vanish into smoke without leaving questions burning still. Imagine the fire rising in the night sky, sparks flying upward into the dark, as though fragments of lives were being carried aloft. Among them, Zelda's spirit seems to ascend, luminous, uncontained at last. The barred windows, the locked doors, the narrow corridors, all yield to flame. In destruction, paradoxically, there is liberation. Perhaps she herself, in her final breath, felt what she had always longed for: release from confinement, release from rivalry, release from the endless struggle to be heard. Fire consumes, but it also purifies, leaving behind only what cannot be destroyed. Her daughter Scotty mourned, her family wept, but the world moved quickly past the story. Only later, when Scott's novels were revived, when scholars and readers began to return to the voices of women forgotten, would Zelda's death be re-examined. Only then would people see the bitter irony of her fate, the way her life had been compressed into an image of glamour and tragedy, while her true self remained locked behind both walls and myths. The crackle of fire grows louder still in imagination, until it fills the ear. We see the walls collapsing, beams falling, flames leaping. We see smoke curling into the sky above the Carolina hills. Then slowly the sound begins to fade. The fire burns itself out, leaving only ashes, only silence, only the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air. Out of that silence rises a new sound, quieter but insistent. The turning of pages, the dust of old books shaken loose, the whispers of readers discovering her again. The fire ends her life, but it opens the doorway to her legacy, to the question of how she would be remembered, and what her life might mean to those who came after. The smoke curls upward into the night, then drifts into dust that settles upon the spines of books, upon the forgotten manuscripts in drawers, upon canvases left in quiet corners. From the ashes of the fire rises not silence, but the stirrings of legacy. For death does not end a life such as Zelda Fitzgerald's. It transforms it into memory, into story, into the fragile yet enduring fabric of how we choose to recall. And so the question begins: who was she, truly, and how shall she be remembered? In the years immediately after her death, the answer was faint and narrow. Obituaries spoke of her as wife of novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald, a figure attached to his fame, her individuality eclipsed. Scholars who revisited his novels noted the echoes of her life in his characters, acknowledging her as inspiration but not as artist. The world was slow to grant her an identity apart from him. For a time she existed only as a shadow in the margins of his brilliance, the tragic muse consumed by madness and flame. But dust does not remain undisturbed forever. By the 1950s and 60s, a new generation of readers discovered Scott's work anew, especially The Great Gatsby, which had been modest in its own time but was now hailed as a masterpiece of American literature. With his revival came renewed interest in Zelda, for readers could not help but ask, who was the woman behind Daisy, behind Gloria, behind Nicole? Who was this figure whose words and diaries had fed his art? Curiosity drew eyes back to her, though often still with pity rather than recognition. Then slowly her own voice began to emerge again. Save Me the Waltz, once dismissed, was reissued. Readers found in its chaotic lyrical prose not incoherence but originality, a daring attempt to capture life through a rhythm different from Scott's. Critics began to ask whether the novel's flaws were not symptoms of illness, but signs of a unique style, one too strange for its time, but resonant for later eyes. Scholars traced her diaries and letters, discovering passages of wit, of sharp insight, of strange beauty. Her paintings, too, were brought into light, exhibited in small shows, appreciated for their whimsical yet haunting power. Feminist critics in the later 20th century took up her story with urgency, challenging the old myths that confined her. They argued that her madness must be seen in the context of a world that denied women autonomy, that her breakdowns were as much the result of silencing as of illness. They read her life not as a cautionary tale, but as a testimony of resistance, of a woman who sought again and again to create despite every barrier. They saw in her both victim and artist, both tragic and triumphant, a figure whose contradictions mirrored the contradictions of her time. Her legacy thus began to shift. No longer only the flapper, no longer only the mad wife, Zelda came to be recognized as an artist in her own right, though one whose art was cut short, interrupted, overshadowed. Her letters revealed a voice at once playful and profound. Her novel revealed a writer willing to risk strangeness. Her paintings revealed a vision untamed by convention. She was, at last, allowed to be more than symbol, though never less than mystery. And yet questions remain, lingering like smoke that refuses to dissipate. Was her creativity inseparable from her illness, or was it thwarted by it? Was she destroyed by Scott, or sustained by him? Was she ahead of her time, or simply lost within it? These questions resist resolution, and perhaps they should, for certainty would betray the ambiguity that defined her. Zelda herself lived in contradiction, defiant yet dependent, free yet confined, brilliant yet broken. To simplify her is to lose her. To hold her complexity is to honor her. Imagine a reader today opening Save Me the Waltz, its pages faintly yellowed, its sentences leaping with strange metaphors. The reader pauses puzzled, then entranced, hearing Zelda's voice directly, without Scott's mediation. Or imagine a visitor standing before one of her paintings in a gallery, seeing angels with radiant wings, children skipping in bright yet unsettling landscapes. In these encounters, Zelda lives again, not as muse, not as symbol, but as artist. Her legacy is not only in how she was remembered, but in how she continues to be rediscovered. The dust of memory settles unevenly, coating some names in layers so thick they vanish, leaving others polished until they shine. Zelda's name remains suspended between. For some, she is still only Scott's wife, still only the flapper. For others, she is the forgotten genius, silenced too soon. The truth, as always, lies in between, shimmering and elusive. She was both muse and creator, both flame and ash, both forgotten and unforgettable. The dust drifts still, stirred by readers, by scholars, by those who linger upon her story with curiosity. And in that dust, one might hear another sound, the faint question of whether a soul like Zelda's can ever truly burn out, or whether it lingers, glowing, in the imagination of those who remember. The question hangs unresolved, like smoke that twists but does not vanish, and in its unresolved shape, we move toward the final meditation, where her restless brilliance and her sorrow are gathered into silence, where her perfume lingers in an empty room, where the story ends not with conclusion, but with farewell. The question drifts like smoke into silence. Can a soul like Zelda's ever truly burn out, or does it linger, glowing faintly, refusing to vanish entirely? The air grows still, and from that stillness rises the final meditation, not of events, but of essence, of the shape her life leaves behind. For the story of Zelda Fitzgerald does not conclude with fire, nor with dust, nor with the judgments of others. It ends only in the hush of reflection, in the quiet recognition that her brilliance and her sorrow cannot be disentangled, that to remember her is to stand within the paradox of a flame, both dazzling and destructive. Zelda lived as few dared to live. From Montgomery to New York, from Paris to Asheville, she carried within her a spirit that refused to be small, a hunger that refused to be satisfied with silence. She shocked, she dazzled, she defied. She burned with the conviction that life must be lived fully, that art must be created fiercely, that freedom must be claimed even when the world insists otherwise. And yet, that very hunger brought her into collision with the limits of body, of mind, of circumstance. She pursued dance until it consumed her strength. She pursued writing until it brought her into battle with her husband. She pursued painting until confinement hemmed her in. Each pursuit was both triumph and undoing, each gesture both declaration and fracture. In Scott, she found a companion equal in ambition, equal in brilliance, equal in ruin. Together, they became the golden couple of the jazz age, embodiments of freedom and glamour. Yet behind the champagne and the headlines lay a darker dance, one of rivalry, resentment, and dependence. Scott wrote her into immortality even as he silenced her. Zelda resisted his shadow even as she remained bound to him. Their love was both bond and wound, their marriage both creation and destruction. To speak of one without the other is to miss the truth that their lives were entwined like threads of the same fabric, impossible to separate without tearing both. And yet Zelda was more than wife, more than muse. She was a woman who created, who insisted upon her own vision even when the world dismissed it. Her novel, flawed and luminous, stands as a testament to her refusal to be voiceless. Her paintings, whimsical and haunted, reveal the persistence of beauty amid confinement. Her letters, filled with wit and tenderness, reveal a mind that remained alive to the end. These works may be scattered, incomplete, overshadowed, but they endure, proof that she was never only inspiration but also creator. To reflect upon Zelda is also to reflect upon memory itself. How do we remember those who lived in contradiction? Do we simplify them into myths, flapper, madwoman, muse, or do we hold the complexity even when it resists neat resolution? Zelda's story invites us to choose the latter, to accept that she was both radiant and troubled, both liberated and confined, both destroyed and enduring. She cannot be contained within one narrative, for her life spilled over every boundary. Perhaps that is her greatest legacy, to remind us that human lives are not neat, that they resist categories, that they are as unruly as fire and as elusive as smoke. Imagine now, in the final stillness of this tale, an empty room. The walls are plain, the window half open, the air heavy with silence. Upon the dresser lies a hairbrush, a small notebook, a folded letter. A canvas rests against the wall, unfinished, its colors bright yet incomplete. The light fades slowly, shadows lengthen, the day moves toward night. And in the air there lingers a faint trace of perfume, delicate, persistent, fading, yet refusing to vanish. It is as though Zelda herself has just stepped from the room, leaving behind the echo of her presence, the suggestion of her essence. She is gone, and yet she remains. And so we bid farewell, not with answers, not with finality, but with the quiet acceptance of ambiguity. Zelda Fitzgerald was a flame that both illuminated and consumed, a woman who lived too brightly for the world she inhabited. To remember her is to feel both wonder and sorrow, both admiration and unease. She was, in the end, human, fragile, defiant, brilliant, broken, and in that humanity lies her truth, a truth that resists erasure, that endures beyond fire, beyond dust, beyond silence. The perfume lingers still, faint but undeniable, in the empty room of memory. It is the last trace of her presence, a reminder that though the body perishes, the essence remains. Close your eyes, dear listener, and breathe it in. Let it guide you gently into sleep, carrying with it the story of Zelda Fitzgerald, the first flapper, the restless artist, the forgotten flame. Her story is not finished, for as long as memory stirs, she will rise again in whispers, in pages, in dreams.